summary. The limitations of the study. Chances are your study was not everything to everyone. Certainly this is important to you, but your study may not be as important to everybody else as you'd like it to be. And in the limitations of your study, you're going to address what has limited your work, potentially, that suggests that it can't be used everywhere by everyone, or just for the mere fact that there are some limitations that are inherent that you cannot control. Your study is going to be limited by some things. Depending on your study and research method and design will depend upon your limitations. In this lesson, what I want to do is share with you a number of items to be concerned with, and then you decide which ones to write about. Look back at your proposal in Chapter 1. In that chapter, you also had a section called Limitations of the Study. You might want to determine whether they're still valid or not. Now, some universities do not require the limitations of the study to be in Chapter 5. If it's in Chapter 1, then maybe you don't have to have it in Chapter 5. The majority of the universities that I have worked with still like to have a section about the limitations in Chapter 5. And this is predominantly because, at least I believe it to be, that not everybody is going to read your entire dissertation from cover to cover. So therefore, they may never even look at Chapter 1. And thus, because limitations are important, because they may provide certain boundaries on the value of your work, it's often recommended that there be a section in Chapter 5 that's the limitations. If you have limitations of the study, both in Chapter 1 and Chapter 5, chances are they're not going to be exactly the same. You may have several in Chapter 1, but you may have a few different ones in Chapter 3 that only relate to the limitations of the data analysis and the applications of your findings to the audience. You might have to go back into Chapter 1 and make some adjustments. Remember, when you did your proposal, that was before you ever collected data. That was what you thought you were going to do and what limitations you thought would be placed on your study once you got started. But now your data is completed, you've got it collected, you've analyzed it, now you're writing in Chapter 5, and you may find that there are limitations that you experienced which you did not perceive and include in your proposal. This is part of going back and aligning your work. Once the proposal was approved and now the data is collected and you're actually creating the dissertation, keep in mind the proposal was a document for a certain purpose. Now, Chapter 1 has a different purpose in the sense that it has to explain everything as it occurred. So there are things that may have to be changed in Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 from your proposal, which are now part of your dissertation. It's important that you know and you take time to go back and look at the limitations. Often students believe that they do not have to go back into Chapters 1, 2, and 3 and make any adjustments once the data is collected and writing their dissertation. This is not true. In fact, I encourage you to go back and reread everything in Chapters 1 and 3, possibly even Chapter 2, to make sure that everything is accurate as a dissertation. Part of the limitations of the study, these are the things or conditions that are out of control of the researcher or things the research did not control. For example, you may not have been able to get all the people that you had hoped for your survey population. Perhaps things changed in your industry. Perhaps people were not going to give you their time freely as you had hoped that they would have. There are many different things, if you will, or variables to consider in the limitations of your study. As I go through the next few slides, I'll give you a few items to look at in your own work and see if they're applicable or not. But keep in mind, limitations are things that are outside of your control. These things that could or did reflect on the results of your study. Perhaps you created a survey on your own and you piloted it and you thought it was a well-done survey, but after you put it into effect and you found out that there were errors in it and it came back to you in the results that people gave you, perhaps that is a limitation of your study, is that you did not thoroughly flush out or make sure that each question was clear. This happened to me at one time when I created a survey. I thought it was good and clear I gave it to 5 other people who reviewed it. We made some minor changes on it. And then when I put it out to actually have people do the survey, then I found out that some of the questions had slang in it. And while Americans certainly understood the American slang, some of the people who did the survey were from other countries, and English was their second language. And therefore, they didn't understand American slang. Now, this was a limitation of that research in that my questions were not as clear as that I hoped they would. Therefore, the results might have been different than if it was clearer in the survey. So what I did is I wrote to the limitations stating basically what I just mentioned about the survey design. Consider in your limitation of the study factors that cause the results to be less likely to be 100% accurate. Do you think that perhaps after you've looked at the data that when you did your interviews or you had your Likert type survey that some people, maybe more than you expected, gave the wrong answers? This is possible. Perhaps you were doing interviews of nurses and you wanted to find out about burnout and how it's affecting them and their performance. Perhaps some of the nurses just finished a shift and they were yelled at or demeaning by some of their employees that they work with. Perhaps then their psyche at the time was not what you had hoped it to be, and they gave you answers which were not necessarily true holistically, but more so reflective of the pain and suffering that they were dealing with on that one day. There are many different factors that could cause the results to be less likely than 100% accurate. When you did your surveys, if you started to notice that many people had questions 1 through 5 that were given to them and that many of them answered all C's, well, perhaps that's less than accurate because somebody just did the survey to get it done. They really didn't give you honest answers. As you spend time analyzing the data and you start to make information out of it, there could be many things that stick out to you during the evaluation or analysis phase that suggests, as you're inferring from all the data collected and that information that's put together, that something was wrong, something didn't go as well as it could have. This is the area in the limitations of the study where you want to address this. Now, for some of you, you'll go right through and you won't have any problem, and that's great. But more than likely, you're going to have some limitation that reflects upon the data and therefore has changed the information than if it was more accurate. What I'd like you to do is think in terms of any problems. As you're looking at the limitations of the study section, think in terms of problems and problems related to the applied research design. When you decide to do a phenomenological design, did perhaps after you got into the study see that perhaps you'd have been better served with a case study? Or if you did the phenomenological design and you ended up having to do 30 interviews before you hit data saturation, perhaps that suggests a problem that the questions were too open-ended, that they weren't focused enough, and therefore it took perhaps longer than one would have expected for data saturation to be achieved. Perhaps if you did a Likert type survey, and like some people do, they'll take 2 different surveys and they'll put them together thinking that more is better. And oftentimes what happens is that instead of answering only 20 or 25 questions, now the survey population has to answer 50 to 70 questions because there's 2 surveys together. It may have seemed like a good idea to do that at the proposal stage, but once you got into the data collection, you realized that a lot of people didn't want to take the time to answer 70 questions and do it honestly. And so therefore, maybe part of the problems with the research design is that the survey was too long. Now, there are many different variables that could go into this research design problem. It's up to you just to be aware when you start analyzing your data to see if there are these different types of variables that have impacted your work in a negative way. Think about the survey population. As I mentioned with my survey, I had given it to a group of people, and not all of them were from the United States, And therefore, some of them had language where English was their second language. They didn't understand the American slang. So with my survey population, part of the limitations is that they didn't all understand how I articulated the actual Likert type questions. And therefore, for those questions in particular, which I was then able to draw out because I looked at which ones had the slang, then I was able to realize that, yeah, the results were inconsistent. And therefore, I had a limitation of my study related to the survey population. As you look at your survey population, in reflection after you collected the data and you're starting to analyze that data, this is one area where you want to look at that's a potential limitation for your study. Another one is that survey instrument itself. If that instrument was asking questions that perhaps weren't as accurate as you hoped to be, or perhaps you did these open-ended interviews. And because you took too much time in doing your interviews that you didn't get to all the questions, perhaps part of your reflections is on that survey instrument where you had perhaps 8 open-ended questions, that the limitation of the study was that you had too many questions, and some people, after they reached an hour time frame, couldn't do the rest of them, or perhaps rushed through the rest of them, and therefore didn't give you complete results as you hoped for. Again, you may find that there are different aspects that could relate to your instrument. Perhaps you didn't ask all the demographic questions when you did your interviews than you wish you would have at the end. This is a common occurrence. Oftentimes people don't think very much or put much thought into creating the demographic questions. They'll ask the general ones, male, female, age range perhaps, or if they're looking at generations, what generation they may be in based on their age. Oftentimes, once we get the data, we wish we would have asked a few more types of demographic questions to help stratify the data. The data collection techniques. Perhaps you decided to use SurveyMonkey.com because you thought it was going to be easy. And then the reality is that because you did SurveyMonkey.com and the time that you were doing your work, a lot of people couldn't get access to the internet perhaps in the organization. Could be many different techniques. Perhaps you're one of those who didn't write a script for your interviews when you decide to interview people for qualitative data collection. And you went into each one just kind of asking the same questions, but not necessarily verbatim. This is often a problem with people who do not write a script and follow it. Oftentimes when they're analyzing the data, they wonder why the answers are so different. Well, oftentimes it's because each time the question was asked to different people, the question was asked differently, perhaps with a couple different words or a few less words, and therefore the clear intent was not provided to each individual person who was surveyed. Again, there could be many different types of data collection techniques that could impact the limitations of your study section. It's up to you to at least consider the ones that you see here on the screen and decide if there are others as well. Another area to consider is this data analysis process. Now, many of you who have qualitative work will use in vivo software or Atlas software to put in all the information and let that produce the common themes. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as you know how to use that system, that you understand that software. You may find that because you did that, you didn't truly understand all of the themes or nodes that were produced, and therefore the data analysis process is not as good as it might have been if you did it manually. Also, some of you will not want to use SPSS, and you'll decide to use an Excel document and put all the information to Excel thinking you'll save yourself some time. Well, Excel only does so much. When you start to analyze the data, you may have to have SPSS. Now, you may not understand SPSS and you don't want to figure it out. Well, that means you just need to get tutored on it, or you need to perhaps pay somebody and let them run it like I did when I did my dissertation. I had somebody else run all the data, and then they tutored me on what it meant. I still had to understand it completely, but I didn't have the skills at the time to be able to do that. Technically, I still don't now. And that's why when I do research in quantitative, I partner up with somebody. But you need to look at your data analysis process. One of the things, when I did my study, I had a Likert type survey. And I had 12 questions that I created. And I had 5 detractors. Two of them were kind of like less likely. One was neutral in the middle, and the other were more than likely and a strong likely. So what I found when I ran the data, I didn't have much information. Statistically, it was significant. One of my committee members told me I should collapse the data for items number 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 and rerun the data. I did that. And then my statistical analysis was different. Then I had significant findings. Now, in my proposal, I did not include that. But in chapter 5, I had to write to the limitations that, in of itself, the actual research data analysis process produced little at first, and then I had to go back and manipulate the data by collapsing the 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 Likert type question answers. So therefore, you might want to look at your work and see, did you do something different in the analysis phase than you had planned when you actually wrote your proposal? Now I want you to think also in terms of these items, which I'm going to share, because these are items you might want to consider. Once you've done all your data analysis, one of the things you want to take a look at is internal validity. Chances are you didn't do a true experiment, because very few of us do that. Scientists in the lab might do more of a pure experiment. So therefore, you may not be able to claim or to positively state that an independent variable actually changed something in a dependent variable. By a Likert type questionnaire, you could find people's self-reporting views, and statistically, with a certain level of confidence, you can predict what would happen, but you can't guarantee it. So as you work through your data analysis, this is one thing you just want to look for, is internal validity. And chances are, if you're looking at internal validity, there's another type of validity you should look for. Do you know what that might be? Sure, it's external validity. External validity relates to how you can make claims or limitations on your findings to a greater audience, on how you perhaps can generalize it to others. If you did your data collection, your study, with a small company, maybe perhaps only 200 people, and you ended up with 112 different Likert type surveys, questionnaires that you were able to use in the data analysis, that's wonderful. But you may not be able to generalize your findings to a greater industry. Same as if you're doing a qualitative study. By interviewing only 20 nurses in one hospital, may be a great research study for what you need to do with your dissertation, but there are some limitations on you being able to generalize that to all nurses in the entire state or country or around the world. These are just areas to think about as you're writing your limitations of the study section. Next, take a look at measurements. How did you measure your data? How did you measure anything that came out with the data? Sometimes in the limitations, the measurement section is how you actually put things together in regards to analysis. If you had to do statistical calculations, how did you measure? If you were looking at doing interviews and you ended up doing 17 interviews before you claimed that you had data saturation, how do you know that data saturation occurred? Because there would have been a measurement somehow reflecting that you hit data saturation at 17. Now, is it possible that, in fact, you didn't hit saturation at 17, you actually hit it at 15, or you really didn't hit it and it was actually, you should have did more interviews? All I'm indicating here is as you start to think about your data and the information, you want to look at, is the measurement and how you produced the data and information a limitation on your study? Also, the analysis phase. Again, I talked about limitations before in your statistical testing, but now is a limitation how you analyze it. Now, some of you who are listening to this program will find that you are a better analysis person than somebody else. There are some people who can just analyze and evaluate things that are in front of them better than others. If this is your first research study, chances are, because you're a journey researcher that's being guided, the analysis may not be as accurate as it could be otherwise. Now, granted, you're going to run the test and you're still going to write about it, but you may want to look at, if you had a complex study, how accurate was the analysis? Was there a possibility that you ran a t-test where you should have ran a chi-square test? Or perhaps maybe in the analysis phase that you didn't actually find data saturation? There's nothing about saying that your study is good or not good. It's about looking realistically at your work and just thinking in terms of the items that you see here and determining which ones you should write about. Chances are you don't have to write about them all. What I'm trying to share in this lesson is that when you think about writing the limitations of your study, think in the terms that I'm reflecting here, because if you create yourself a checklist, some of them may be applicable, some of them may not. And so if it's not, then you don't have to write about it because it's not a limitation of your study. A few other areas to consider as you're writing the limitations of your study section in Chapter 5. Bias. We all have bias somehow, some way. We all tend to believe, at least most of us do, when we start our study, what some of the findings are going to be. If you're a woman and you're doing a study on how women have hit the glass ceiling and haven't been promoted, you have bias. If you're a nurse and you're experiencing nurse burnout and you're doing a study to help other nurses as well as yourself, you have bias. We all have biases. We have political biases. We have biases that deal with religion. We have biases on how we should raise our children. We have biases on the schools we go to. It's okay. One of the things you want to do is just consider, did bias come into play in regards to the researcher, yourself? Perhaps you like qualitative research. You like phenomenological designs because it took you forever to learn how to spell the word. Now you can spell it, you like it. And you like the idea you only have to interview about 20 people. Well, if that's the type of research method and design you applied, perhaps there's a little bit of bias there. Perhaps when you did the evaluation, you liked that design so much that you maybe went too deep into it. Perhaps as the researcher, you actually were one of those nurses and you did a survey on other nurses and to find out what's going on in regards to nursing burnout. Of course, there could be this bias from you because you're actually one of those people in that survey population. It's just something to consider as a limitation. Were you too close to your topic? The survey population. The survey population could potentially be biased. If you're doing research, Likert type questions on how employees perform based on how they're communicated with, if they don't like the supervisor, or the supervisor just gave them bad news that there's going to be layoffs in the next 30 days, and they just happen to get your survey 2 days after that, chances are there's going to be a little bias in that survey population. You won't know this until after the data is collected. You may never even know this, but these are areas in regards to bias that you should be looking at and then including the areas that are appropriate. Even if the survey population was biased, even if all of a sudden when they got your survey, they were upset because they thought that either they or some of their friends are going to get laid off, it's okay. It's still data that was collected. What you want to do is, in that case, if you knew that information, you'd write a limitation about that to say, unbeknownst to you, when you started to plan to do the survey, you didn't know that layoff news was going to happen. Therefore, potentially, your survey population may have been biased, and therefore perhaps the results are not generalizable to a greater audience. And it's fine to write something like that, and it's important just to note that these are areas to consider. Another area to consider is experts consulted. Some of you may hire an expert. You may have experts that you consult. For example, if you do a field test of phenomenological questions to make sure that each question is designed in a phenomenological manner to produce answers that are needed. For example, perhaps you took your questionnaire once it was drafted, your survey, and you gave it to 3 or 5 experts in phenomenological designs, and they looked at it. Well, depending on what level of expertise they are, might depend on what kind of feedback you got. Perhaps they all looked at it and gave you feedback, but you learned later that perhaps one of them was not really an expert in phenomenological designs. That was an expert in case studies. So you may want to say in your limitations that information. Or perhaps you realize after the fact you went to experts who are experts in nursing instead of going to experts in phenomenology. Now, this is a common concern. If it's your situation, it's a little too late, But oftentimes a field test, some students believe they should give it to an expert that's a nurse, in case you're doing a survey on nurses, part of the survey population. This is not true. The idea of experts consulted in a field test for a phenomenological questionnaire would be to give it to experts who are experts in phenomenology research. Societal norms. There are biases in society. Depending on what part of the country you live in, what country you live in, and where you may travel, there are societal norms, just like cultural norms. These are important, and they help keep people working and living well under certain types of guidance as laws or different organizational rules, if you will. It's just important to note that perhaps there may be some bias based on societal norms. If part of your survey population ended up being people who were different in regards to their religion or their politics than you expected, and therefore perhaps it could have made a difference in your data collection, it's just another area to consider, and if you need to write about it, write about it. There's nothing wrong with all these areas of biases. They're normal. We just want to look and decide whether you, in your work, need to account for any of them or not. As always, when you're writing Chapter 5, remember, think about the future reader of your work 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. They may want to know if there were any of these biases, because perhaps if they're going to extend your study or do work based on what you did, if you saw a bias, then they can account for that bias when they do their efforts. Each of my mentees' work that I've used throughout this program provide me written consent to use their work. This allows me to help you to see how others have done it. They own the copyright to their work. I just am applying it to this program, taking the B out of ABD, which I own the copyright for. In the examples I'm going to share with you, they all come from Dr. Joseph Hagee. Dr. Joseph Hagee is an award-winning dissertation author. He won the Dissertation of the Year award, and I believe it's in a large part to do with his efforts to make his work to a level of breadth and depth that exceeded the average of what was required. I hope that you'll do the same too. As we go through all these sections in Chapter 5, if you actually look to provide as much breadth and depth and practical help to others, then you'll find that your work's going to take on a different flavor of being far better designed and presented than the average dissertation. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee's dissertation is titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study. Dr. Hagee wrote this: "This study was limited by the number of participants who completed the survey. The study was limited to participants who agreed to participate voluntarily. Although this study used validated survey instruments, the participants might have had difficulties interpreting the survey questions." Now, the reason he added this item here, because he had his survey, which was originally done in English, translated to Arabic, and he gave it in Arabic. And so because of the translation, perhaps not everybody understood it as he had hoped they would. The reliability of the data was limited to the self-reported feedback, honesty, social desirability, and recollections of the survey participants. Self-rating bias was likely, as individuals tend to exaggerate their expertise and character. Now, these are very valid limitations. They also are common, depending on what kind of questions you're asking. It's, for example, if you ask questions about somebody who used a fitness center for the last year and they did not get in any better shape, chances are when they do their self-reporting, they're going to be biased because they're not going to be able to say honestly that was their fault. It's probably because the gym equipment didn't work or something else was wrong, not themselves. Moving on to another section that he wrote, certain individuals may not necessarily behave in certain ways in a leader-follower exchange because of their religion. Instead, political and societal context must be considered as an influencing factor over their attitudes and views. So as you can see here, this is one of the limitations I discussed a few minutes ago. Depending on who you're surveying, you may find that the cultural norms of society where you're doing your reviews or doing your data collection will impact your work somehow, some way, and may potentially be a limitation. In this lesson, I reflected on limitations of the study. I gave you some ways and areas and things to think about as you put this section together. I gave you several examples. I also, in those examples, reflected how in the lesson I shared information about those examples. As you look to write the limitations of your study section, it's important that you look and determine, was there anything or anyone that influenced your data collection or your data analysis or the data reporting that you didn't expect? Could somebody have else done the survey or the interviews the exact same way and were able to get the exact same answers as you? If the answer is probably not, which is usually true, what would have caused that? Perhaps it was the research bias. Perhaps it was the bias of the population you used. As with everything in Chapter 5, it's not so much that you need to address every item that I talk about. It's that you at least consider it. And if it's a reflection that's worthy of noting, then please do. You're better off including it, and perhaps maybe your dissertation chair or committee member will say, no, it's not that important, you don't have to have it. It's better to do it that way than not put it in there and nobody catch it. It goes to be reviewed at the university level and they deny your work because you weren't accurate in this area of limitations or perhaps any other area. These are all the lessons in the series on Chapter 5 on how to complete your dissertation. I just addressed item number 4 here, which is limitations of the study. The next lesson will be on recommendations. As you go through all these lessons, make sure you're taking good notes. When you go back and write any of these sections, I encourage you, re-listen to the lesson again. Take notes again. Then incorporate that into your work. After you put your work together, if you really want to make sure your work is done well, listen to the lesson again one more time. And as I speak about what should be in there, then you look in your work and see if you addressed it fully or if you don't need to at all. The idea is to use this lesson and all the lessons in this program is to help you to get your work to be developed as good as you can the first time so that you can get your approvals and move forward and graduate. Review the limitations you started with Chapter 1. You may have to change them. Don't forget, as you start to look at all the limitations, make sure that they're accurate in Chapter 1 and Chapter 5. Or if your dissertation chair or your university requires you not to have limitations in Chapter 5, then make sure all the items I talked about here in Chapter 5 are incorporated appropriately so in Chapter 1 in the section Limitations of the Study. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I look forward to providing you the next lesson.